Abraham surrendered himself to the paradox which is capable of transforming murder into a holy act well-pleasing to God. Welcome to Philosophers Explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics. From each I've selected an excerpt, no more than an hour, often 40 minutes or so. Our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and more particularly the excerpt entitled The Panegyric to Abraham, in which Kierkegaard takes up the perplexing, bewildering, and deeply unsettling story of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac because it was commanded by God. Let's go to the text. Kierkegaard's Panegyric upon Abraham. Panegyric is a published speech or writing in praise of some other human being. So in this case, Abraham of Genesis, father of Isaac, husband of Sarah, and his struggles with God's command that he should sacrifice his son Isaac. What makes this heroic and a foundational text and foundational story in the three great Western religions? It's from a work called Fear and Trembling, published late in 1843. And Fear and Trembling is meant to evoke, of course, some earlier biblical passages from Psalms and Philippians, the idea being that at one's core, if one is a religious person, one should fear God. And when one considers the awesomeness of God's power, his knowledge, and his ultimate justice, one trembles for one's own fate when one goes before the ultimate tribunal. So Abraham is one such person who did this, and Kierkegaard is giving his interpretation of the significance of the Abraham story. So let's start. If there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the founding of all there lay only a wildly seething power which, writhing with obscure passions, produced everything that is great and everything that is insignificant, if a bottomless void, never satiated, lay hidden beneath all, what then would life be but despair? And here's Kierkegaard writing in the 1840s, and it's very likely that he has Arthur Schopenhauer in mind in writing a sentence such as this. If we don't have an eternal consciousness or an immortal soul, then that would make life nothing but despair. Ultimately, we would die. It would then be pointless. Kierkegaard goes on to elaborate on that theme. If one generation, if this was the nature of human life, arose after another like the leafage in a forest, if the one generation replaced the other like the song of the birds in the forest, things that are ephemeral and come and go and are soon to be forgotten. If the human race passed through the world as the ship goes through the sea, like the wind through the desert, a thoughtless and fruitless activity, if an eternal oblivion were always lurking hungrily for its prey, and there was no power strong enough to wrest it from its maw, how empty then and comfortless life would be. So what is the meaning of life? This is the question here. We know that we are alive. We know that we have consciousness, but what is the nature of our life? It is just a temporary blip in the grand sweep of time, soon to be forgotten. Is our consciousness an ephemeral, supervening property on our physical life, again, to go out of existence? Everything that we have thought, felt, dreamed, hoped to be going into non-existence and then soon forgotten. If there is no such thing then as eternal life, an eternal soul, and a God, then it seems life is pointless. Now, I mentioned that Fear and Trembling was written in late 1843, and I want to say that's significant because it's often read as a companion piece, close following on another work published early in 1843 called Either or. And in that book, Kierkegaard, in the either or, presented us with a very stark alternative set of answers to the question of what the meaning of life what the meaning of life is. And one is presented by one of the characters in either or, is a rather hedonistic approach to life. What that he calls the aesthetic life. And aesthetic here means appealing to the senses. So one indulges one's senses, and the senses, of course, are rather short-term, momentary indulgences, and so one seeks sex and good food and the pleasures of art and so forth. And that is, by committing to that life and indulging it fully, the meaningful life that a human being can acquire. And in the same book, Kierkegaard then juxtaposes to that another answer to the question of the meaning of life that he calls the ethical life. And this is a life of realizing that one is making choices and that one is responsible for one's choices, and that one follows the law and commits to the moral law and does one's duties, fulfills one's obligations strictly and severely. And there is then a kind of ethical dignity and meaning that can come from committing to that kind of life. Now, in the first case, of course, there are lots of hedonists and those who are enamored of a more aesthetical approach to life, who have worked that territory over the course of many generations. There are those who have praised the ethical life, perhaps, and of course, most likely, Kierkegaard has someone like Kant in mind, strict, uncompromising duty and one's dignity coming from committing to always doing one's strict duty. But neither of those seems fully satisfactory, and it seems that they are not only in contradiction to each other, but leave something rather unfulfilled. Of course, the aesthetic life doesn't seem particularly ethical. The ethical life doesn't seem like it's very much fun, and they are, in fact, in contradiction to each other. But toward the end of either or, Kierkegaard leaves us with another character who gives us some suggestions that perhaps there is a way to transcend this paradox, to get past this opposition, and he introduces there a more religiously oriented approach to life, and Fear and Trembling then is that exploration. And what's interesting about this then is that we then have a trinity or a trilogy of alternatives, an aesthetic hedonistic approach that's not very ethical and often seems to be packaged with a denial of religion, an ethical approach that obviously, if one is always doing one's duty, it's not very much fun, seems opposed to the pleasures of life, but then also does not seem necessarily to involve a commitment to any sort of a religious sort of life, and then a religious approach to life. And here we start to think about the story of Abraham and his willingness to kill his own son Isaac. This is in the core founding opening text of Scripture, and here we have an answer to the question of the meaning of life that is obviously not very aesthetic, that is to say, not very pleasurable, but also does not seem to be particularly ethical if one is willing to engage in such a barbaric, murderous act. But nonetheless, is there something then to this religious act, and can we learn from Abraham? But to return then to the text, therefore it is not thus, but as God created man and woman, so too he fashioned the hero and the poet and the orator. But because there is a God and God created us, that makes it possible for life to be more than a blip in time and our consciousness to be more than some ephemeral phenomenon that's going to be forgotten very soon. What is the nature then of religious heroism? What is the nature of true human greatness? Now, in this next paragraph, Kierkegaard indicates that one indication of the importance of heroism is that he will not be forgotten. And in this panegyric, it is a theme that he returns to a few times. One will not be forgotten, just as Abraham is not forgotten. And here we are thousands of years later, still talking about Abraham as a great human being core to our culture. No, not one shall be forgotten who was great in the world. But what's the nature of greatness? And there are different species of greatness Kierkegaard goes on to delineate here. Each was great in his own way, and each in proportion to the greatness of that which he loved. So one criterion of greatness and one measure then of greatness is going to be in terms of that which one loves and commits to in a loving way. And there's a hierarchy that Kierkegaard proposes. For he who loved himself became great by himself, and he who loved other men became great by his selfless devotion. But he who loved God became greater than all. So there's me, and I'm of some significance. Other men are of greater significance. God is of even greater significance. So what do you love? And that will be one measure of your greatness. Another attitudinal commitment, one's expectation. What does one expect from one's life? One became great by expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal. But he who expected the impossible became greater than all. So, what do you expect out of life? Do you enumerate possibilities and expect those possibilities to be realized in this life? Or are you focused then on the eternal and you expect eternity? But then there is something even beyond that expectation, expecting the impossible, that which cannot be realized, but you would expect it nonetheless. That, Kierkegaard is suggesting, is even greater. So we're entering into paradoxical, mysterious territory here. Everyone shall also be remembered, but each was great in proportion to the greatness of that with which he strove. What do you commit to fight with, to struggle with, to pit yourself against, the striving? And again, we will rank things in terms of the challenge of the striving. So there was strife upon earth. There was one who overcame all by his power, and there was one who overcame God by his impotence. So we can start with man against man, one man against 1,000, but then there's a suggestion here is he who strove with God was greater than all. So God is the greatest thing that you can pit yourself against or with or strive with respect to. But then there's this interesting opposition here between saying striving, of course, is a test of one's power, a test of one's strength, and the goal is to overcome, to assert one's strength. But here Kierkegaard introduces the paradoxical note that one is going to overcome God by one's impotence. And of course, it doesn't seem possible that one could overcome God by one's power, so one needs to go in another direction here. So, there was one who was great by reason of his power, one who was great by reason of his wisdom, and one who was great by reason of his hope, and one who was great by reason of his love. But Abraham was greater than all. And so that then is to say that Abraham's greatness does not reside in his power, in his wisdom, in his hope, or in his love. It is something else, and this is going to be faith. And Kierkegaard's understanding of Abraham as a hero of faith and what goes into that. And we get, again, a paradoxical description of it. Abraham was greater than all, great by reason of his power, whose strength is impotence. Great by reason of his wisdom, whose secret is foolishness. Great by reason of his hope, whose form is madness. Great by reason of the love which is hatred of oneself. So, Abraham was impotent, foolish, mad, and hated himself. And somehow out of that we get his greatness, and that is going to be core to faith. By faith, Abraham went out from the land of his father. By faith, he was a stranger in the land of promise. By faith, going on to the next paragraph, Abraham received the promise from God that in his seed all the races of the world would be blessed. And so here Kierkegaard is hearkening back to the earlier passage long before the sacrifice, long before the conception of Isaac, where God makes a compact or a covenant with Abraham that through him the future generations of a mighty nation will then arise. Okay, problem is Abraham is childless with his wife Sarah. He had had a child with his slave woman Hagar, but he and Sarah are both getting old, and it does not seem particularly possible that they're going to conceive nonetheless. Time passed, the possibility was there. Abraham believed. Okay, well, maybe old people can get pregnant. It's still possible. But then even more time passed. It became unreasonable. Abraham believed. So, what is possible? What is reasonable? What is my understanding of human capacities? That's not going to be relevant to faith. And so there's a tension then, perhaps an outright opposition already between reason and faith. And the hero of faith is not going to then be a reasonable person. Then Abraham's attitude as all of this is going on. I'm supposed to be fathering a child with my wife Sarah. The days are ticking by here. What's going on? But that's not Abraham's attitude. He did not mournfully count the days while time passed. He did not look at Sarah with a suspicious glance, wondering whether she were growing old. He did not arrest the course of the sun that Sarah might not grow old, and his expectation with her. Abraham became old, and Sarah became a laughingstock in the land. And yet he was God's elect and inheritor of the promise that in his seed all the races of the world would be blessed. But Abraham believed. He held fast the expectation. And this is critical here. If Abraham had wavered, he would have given it up. If he had said to God, then perhaps it is not after all thy will that it should come to pass, and so I will give up the wish. It was only my wish, it was my bliss. My soul is sincere, I hide no secret malice, because thou didst deny to me. So maybe Abraham would kind of quietly give up without calling God to account and said, hey, you promised this, what's going on here, you're disappointing me. None of that is going on in Abraham. Had he done any of those things, then he would not be the father of faith. All right, so then came the fullness of time. He who believes preserves an eternal youth. So he's getting physically older. Sarah is getting physically older, but Abraham nonetheless is eternally young. Sarah, his wife, well, though stricken in years, she was still young enough to desire the pleasures of motherhood. And Abraham, though gray-haired, was young enough to wish to be a father. So they wanted it at the same time. And then it happened. There was joy in Abraham's house when Sarah became a bride on the day of their golden wedding. So they've been married for many, many years, and then Sarah becomes pregnant. So Isaac is born, Isaac becomes a youth, Isaac grows, some years pass, happy story so far, but still once more Abraham was to be tried. God tempted Abraham and said unto him, take Isaac thine only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will show thee. Now imagine receiving that command, putting yourself in Abraham's sandals. Right? God or God's emissary appears to you and gives you a command like this. What of the promise? If I kill Isaac, it seems like the promise is going to be broken. Was God just jesting? Was he just, has he changed his mind? I love my son Isaac. You're asking me to kill someone whom I love. That seems rather cruel. Isaac is a young guy. He's not, particularly evil or wicked, deserving of death. And so this seems, if I were to just kill him, to be an act of injustice. Not only that, what would it do to Sarah, whom I also care for and love? So this is perplexing if I think about it. It is unreasonable if I think about it, and perhaps that is the key. If I think about it, and maybe that is not what Abraham is going to do. But he tries to put, he now being Kierkegaard himself, in Abraham's position. So the Lord was only making sport of Abraham. He made miraculously the preposterous actual, and now in turn he would annihilate it. It was indeed foolishness, but Abraham did not laugh at it like Sarah when the promise was announced. 70 years of faithful expectation, brief joy at the fulfillment of faith. Now then we are thinking and trying to figure out what is going on with God. What is he trying to do here? Why would he make this kind of commitment here? And suppose anybody were to do this sort of thing to any other person. So who then is he that plucks away the old man's staff? So the old man is relying on his staff to get around. You go to the old man and you take away his staff. Of course, you know the old man is going to fall to the ground unsupported. Abraham is now reliant upon on Isaac. Isaac is his staff, his main support. Who's going to take that away? What kind of cruel being would even do so? And then even worse, who is it that requires that he himself shall break it? You go to an old man and you threaten him and make him break his own staff, put himself in that position of faithful. You go to Abraham and you ask the father to kill his own son. Is there anything more sadistic that you could do to a parent than not only take their son away, but also to ask them to be the instrument of their son being killed? How utterly cruel. What kind of godlike being would do any such thing? Is there no compassion for the venerable oldling and none for the innocent child? Of course, yeah, it seems unjust. You don't kill innocent people. What kind of being would just kill any human being who does not deserve to be killed, much less a child with his entire life ahead? And yet Abraham was God's elect, and it was the Lord who imposed the trial. All would now be lost. The glorious memory to be preserved by the human race, the promise in Abraham's seed. This was only a whim, a fleeting thought which the Lord had, which Abraham should now obliterate. The glorious treasure. Why? That's the question a reasonable, decent human being will ask if he is ever in such a circumstance. For what significance had it when Isaac was to be sacrificed? Why? The old man would not be joyful in death as he had laid his hands in blessing upon Isaac, but he would be weary of life as he laid violent hands upon Isaac. Right? What a terrible dilemma. But it's God who is imposing the test. And yet Abraham believed. And then interestingly, Kierkegaard mentions this, that he believed for this life. So that is to say, Abraham has worldly hopes. It matters to him what happens in this life, in this world, even after he is gone. It is not simply a matter of, well, I will obey this command, and if I obey the command, then I will get life in the afterworld, or I will get some sort of eternal life. His hope is not for that. His hope is for this world. Yea, if his faith had been only for a future life, he surely would have cast everything away in order to hasten out of this world to which he did not belong. Right, so if we take one kind of standard religious answer, that you just do all of these things on this world and it's just a series of tests or a matter of building up one's resume so that you can get eternal life, and so the sacrifices that you do on earth aren't really sacrifices, they're just kind of costs or maybe even an investment in a future life, that then, according to Kierkegaard, is to miss the point about faith and the genuine meaning of sacrifice. Abraham wants Isaac to live. He wants Isaac to become a parent, and through Abraham and then Isaac on earth, there will be future generations. That is what his hope consists in. That is what he is being asked to sacrifice, and his faith is being tested precisely with respect to that. Yet Abraham believed, and he did not doubt. He believed the preposterous. Right? And so notice this. Right? This act makes no sense. If I follow through, it breaks the covenant. If I follow through, it seems God is whimsical, or it seems like God is forgetful. If I follow through, it seems like God is cruel at a minimum, and perhaps even sadistic at a maximum. There's no way, when I think about this as a human being, using my mind, using my reason, I can understand it. It's a preposterous thing for anyone to ask, and it's a preposterous thing for God to ask. But Abraham believed it, and his faith is going to be constituted by his willingness to act with respect to the preposterous. If Abraham had doubted, then he would have done something else, something glorious, of course. Right? He goes on to say, well, maybe Abraham would have said, this makes no sense to me. I'm in such despair. I'm so much without hope. But as a father, I can't possibly kill my own son, Isaac. And so what I will do is I will just kill myself in order to relieve my own misery, but just make all of this terribleness go away. Now, that would have been a great act, but it would not be a faithful act. He would have plunged his knife into his own breast. He didn't do that. Abraham believed. We read in those holy books, and God tempted Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, Abraham, where art thou? And he said, here I am. He did not hide, right? He didn't say, I'm hearing the voice of God or God's emissary here. I hope he doesn't find me. Instead, what he says is Abraham faces up joyantly, buoyantly, confident with a loud voice. He answered God's call, here I am. When the fateful day arises, he doesn't put it off. And Abraham arose early in the morning, as though it were to a festival. So he hastened, and early in the morning he had come to the place spoken of, to Mount Moriah. Very interesting catch. He said nothing to Sarah. Kierkegaard emphasizes this. What could he have said to Sarah? Where are you going today, dear? I'm going to take our son Isaac to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice to God. I'm going to kill him. Could he have explained it to Sarah? Could he have made it reasonable to Sarah? Could he have made her understand why he is doing what he is doing? No, there's no way to do so, so he does not even try. And then to hearken back to the earlier stories, there is no aesthetic pleasure in this, and there seems to be no ethics in this. This would be murder, this would be pain, this would be suffering. And so we do seem to be entering into another mode of being, what Kierkegaard, of course, is calling the religiously faithful one, that is neither aesthetic nor ethical. He cleft the wood, he bound Isaac, he lit the pyre and drew the knife. So he's ready to do the deed. Isaac is bound on the pyre, it is lit, he has the knife in hand, he's ready. Kierkegaard interjects again, my hearer, there was many a father who believed that with his son he lost everything that was dearest to him in the world, that he was deprived of every hope for the future. And our hearts go out horribly to those parents who have lost their children. Is there anything more devastating than that? But even that does not touch the seriousness of Abraham's situation, Kierkegaard is telling us. But yet there was none that was the child of promise in the sense that Isaac was for Abraham. Abraham stood to lose more than any of those parents. There was many a father who lost his child, but then it was God. It was the unalterable, the unsearchable will of the Almighty. It was his hand took the child. So other parents, when they lose their children, can say, well, it's the will of God, and they can console themselves in some sense, even in the midst of their devastation. Abraham will not have that option. Not so with Abraham. For him was reserved a harder trial, and Isaac's fate was laid along with the knife in Abraham's hand. Abraham's not going to be able to say, well, it was the will of God. Instead, it was my will, my choice. I did this. And so that vehicle of consolation is not going to be available to him. He knew that it was God the Almighty who was trying him. He knew that it was the hardest sacrifice that could be required of him. But he knew also that no sacrifice was too hard when God required it, and he drew the knife. All right. Now, Kierkegaard really wants us to pause in this. What kind of heroic, great being, not only in stature, but now we're adding that normative sense, this awesome being that we know as Abraham, where did his strength come from? What or who gave strength to Abraham's arm? Who held his right hand up so that it did not fall limp at his side? That is the hard question. To the extent that one is capable of doing what Abraham did, one is great, one is a hero. And it can't be that God is doing it, it has to be that you are doing it. In this case, Abraham is doing it. That is what makes him the hero. If Abraham, when he had stood upon Mount Moriah, had doubted, if he had gazed about him irresolutely, if when he drew the knife he had by chance discovered the ram, oh, look over there's a ram, maybe I can kill the ram and offer that as a sacrifice, and God will be satisfied with that. If God had permitted him to offer it instead of Isaac, then he would have betaken himself home. Everything would have been the same. He has Sarah, he retained Isaac, and yet how changed? Because of his irresolution, his looking for a substitute, his accepting a substitute, that inward acceptance, irresolution would have irremediably changed the circumstance, even though all of the external circumstances remain the same. Venerable Father Abraham, in marching home from Mount Moriah, thou hadst no needs of a panegyric which might console thee for thy loss, for thou didst gain all and didst retain Isaac. And again, we return to that theme of we now, thousands of years later, we remember, we marvel, we are in awe at what Abraham did. Thousands of years have run their course since those days, but thou hadst no tardy lover to snatch the memorial of thee from the power of oblivion. You don't need me to keep your memory alive. You are out there, you will always be remembered. Every language calls thee to remembrance. Again, Venerable Father Abraham, thou who first was sensible of and didst first bear witness to that prodigious passion which disdains the dreadful conflict with the rage of the elements and with the powers of creation in order to strive with God. Thou who first didst know that highest passion, the holy, pure, and humble expression of the divine madness which the pagans admire. The divine madness, that is faith. And I'll close with one other quotation from a work published 3 years later after Fear and Trembling, a postscript in which Kierkegaard still working this theme of faith, its relationship to reason, its relationship to understanding, its opposition to both of them with a willingness to act as God has commanded, absolutely, obediently, without question, without understanding. Faith, as Kierkegaard then puts it, requires a crucifixion of the understanding. The crucifixion of the understanding is faith.